Well, hello. It's a pleasure to talk to you about the concept of the exhibition Jan van Eyck's Optical Revolution, which was held in the city of Ghent earlier this year, 2020, but unfortunately had to close after 6 weeks due to the current COVID-19 conditions. Anyhow, it's great to talk about it, and I'll explain something of how we came about with the idea of making this exhibition. Well, actually, it all started during the conservation, the first phase of the conservation of the Ghent altarpiece, the conservation treatment of the outside wings of the altarpiece that started in 2012 and ended in 2016. During the treatment, a lot of overpaint was removed, and as the work continued, we realized that this painting was not the odd one out in the oeuvre of Jan van Eyck, as has always been taught before. We saw that it adheres much better to the picture we have of the entire oeuvre attributed to Jan van Eyck. And as we went along with this treatment, we realized that we were developing a new vision on Van Eyck. And then we came up with this idea of making a new exhibition. And we were able to get from the cathedral in Ghent the outside wings, which we see here. So the Annunciation and the patrons and the two St. John's, the cityscape and the still life with the prophets and the sibyls, but also Adam and Eve. And that has something to do with the material history of the painting. In the early 19th century, the wings, except Adam and Eve and their respective reverses, so that's the still life and the cityscape, these wings were sold to an art dealer, and eventually they ended up in the Museum of Berlin. There, at the end of the 19th century, because one wanted to exhibit them one next to the other, they had the idea of sawing them in their thickness lengthwise, all those panels. And as Adam and Eve never went to Berlin, so never underwent this horrific treatment, they still form still one unity with their reverses. And that is why we had them in the exhibition too. As you noticed, actually these panels form pairs. We have Adam and Eve indeed, then of course the still life and the cityscape, the Madonna and the Angel of the Annunciation, the two patrons, the two simulated sculptures, they form pairs. And we use these pairs as a point of departure for setting up the show. But we started with a concept, and that concept can be easily summarized in one phrase. Jan van Eyck created a new vision on reality that was to influence Western painting up until the present. Now, how did we operationalize this concept? Well, by asking a number of questions. How does this new vision manifest itself in the works of Van Eyck themselves? That's why we needed as many works as we could get. and we were rather successful in getting a lot of work, the most works ever assembled in one exhibition by the artist. Then a second question, how can that be related to contemporary developments, mainly in Italy, where, of course, you have also this new vision on reality with the development of linear perspective during the early Renaissance, mainly in Florence. So it's some sort of benchmarking these two new visions on reality. Then the next question, how does this vision influence other media, sculpture, illumination of manuscripts, and also some applied arts? And then the last question we asked ourselves is, how did this vision resonate in the following centuries, and mainly in the 16th, where we see a lot of very important sources, literature about Van Eyck, and then, of course, the origins of the myth that he was the inventor of oil painting, created by Vasari. And then in the 19th century, where this myth took on nationalistic proportions in the context of the development of the early Belgian state. So man and myth was another topic of the exhibition. Because we had to close due to COVID, one of the first things we did was actually we made immediately a virtual visit, which you still can consult on the following website, which is to be found on the museum website msk.ghent.be. And here you have some idea of this virtual visit, where you can go to all the works themselves, hear the comments of the audio guide, and read all the labels and so forth. As I told you, we used the pairs, like for instance those simulated sculptures, as a point of departure for setting up the exhibition. So these imitated sculptures of the two St. Johns we compared to real contemporary sculpture, little known actually, these sculptures from the church in Anderlecht. We compare them to other contemporary sculpture, to drawings, manuscripts that in which the same models were used, and so forth. So that's a good, this slide gives a good view of the layout of the exhibition. To my mind, the portrait gallery was one of the most impressive rooms in the exhibition, because, well, here in the slide it's much more light, and there's much more light than in reality. It was all, the light was more subdued, and it looked as if all those portraits, all those sitters of Van Eyck, who of course were his friends, his wife, his colleagues and patrons, all these people seemed to come out of the darkness into the light, into the room of the space of the spectator. So that was like you were encircled by Jan van Eyck's social network, and it was a very impressive experience. Now, how can we explain this phenomenon of Jan van Eyck that seems to turn up out of nowhere, basically, in art history in the 1430s in the Netherlands? We think there are three aspects in this new vision. First is very well visible when you compare his work to what was happening during the previous generation. And I'm showing here one of the wings of Melchior Broederlam's Retable de Chambol, painted exactly 30 years earlier, so exactly one generation. And of course, in comparison to the Annunciation wings of the Ghent altarpiece. When we take a closer look at two details, the Madonna of Broederlam and then, of course, Eve of Van Eyck, we see notable differences in using the technique of oil painting. Yes, indeed, Broederlam also painted already in oils, be it in more meager emulsion, but he applied oil in an old-fashioned way, like he was still painting in tempera. And look at the highlights, it's applied with little stripes, parallel hatching, and you see very well the brush strokes, also the stylized hair. When we compare that to Van Eyck, you don't see any brush stroke anymore. The light is gliding over the surface of the skin, and the hair seemed to be painted individually, which is not the case, of course, but he gives that strong suggestion. So things become much more lifelike, and that means Van Eyck employs to the fullest all the possibilities of the technique of oil painting. How did he do that? Well, he didn't invent oil painting, of course, we know that since the end of the 18th century, but he improved it so much by adding, among others, secatives to have the oil dry better, faster, so the medium became much more handleable. And this allowed him also to paint every suggestion of material, of tactile materiality, of different textures, different alloys, like here in the kettle and so forth, or in those organ pipes. The cutting of the wood in relief, the gold brocade of the chasuble of the angel, and all those different textures are very lifelike. First of all, of course, very well observed in the first place, but also with this technique of oil paint, very well suggested in painting. When he observes flowers, for instance, it seems like he does it with an attitude of an academic. He looks at reality with a pre-scientific attitude. The observation is so accurate as if it can be compared actually to what we find in botanical encyclopedias of the end of the 16th century, so more than 150 years later. When he paints rocks, like in this little panel of St. Francis in Turin, when he paints those rocks, it's so accurately observed that geologists are able to date the different strata of the rock. He's really able to paint everything, even one of the most difficult things, water. And he does that here. We see, of course, a very small detail of the painting of the Madonna and Chancellor Rollin in the Louvre. And he paints that water through the reflections of objects in the water. which is extremely difficult but extremely well observed. We shouldn't forget also that those figures walking on the bridge are barely 2 millimeters high. As I said, painting water is extremely difficult, and I can show that here we have the fountain of the Ghent altarpiece, where we see that water falling down but also splashing up. And what happens when water splashes up, I can show you that in this little movie. The water falls down and jumps up, forms a sphere, simultaneously concentric circles, then it falls down again and it jumps up again to form again a spherical, a spherical object. And that is something we can observe in with modern technology, looking at a small movie in slow motion, but which Van Eyck was able to observe in those details in the water, as you can see. So his observation was simply incredible. The accuracy of his observation cannot be compared to anyone else's. But it's not only a matter of being able to observe with great accuracy, it is also his hand or eye-hand coordination, which was incredible, because he was able to, whatever he observed in such an accurate fashion, to paint it in oils on panel. In an incredibly realistic way. So it's that combination, of course, of his attitude and his dexterity. Now, a last aspect, beside the perfection of the technique of oil painting and his excellence in visual observation, a third factor plays an important role, according to us, that is the curators of the exhibition. He can be considered as the first learned artist in the North, a pictor doctus. He was apparently very well aware of natural science, optics, alchemy, testified by his experiences or his experiments rather in with oil painting and with oils, different oils. He must have been very well aware of contemporary theological discussions. Now, we do have sources for that. And one of the first sources is a letter from the Duke of Burgundy to his financial administration in 1435. As you all know, Jan van Eyck became a court painter in 1425, and he was paid an annual pension, an annual honorarium. At a certain moment, the administration is late in paying his honorarium, and the Duke writes the following words to his administration, urging them to pay his painter as fast as possible. And he says, nous ne trouverions point le pareil à notre gré, ne si excellent en son art et science. We won't find the like to our like, so excellent in his art and science. A second document, which is known since a long time, but has not always been taken very seriously, is Bartolomeo Fazio in his De Viris Illustribus, published in 1456, which is only 15 years after Jan van Eyck's death, he considers or talks about 4 painters among whom Jan van Eyck, whom he calls the most important painter of his time. And he says a few things that are very interesting. He says, for instance, he was not poorly versed in letters, especially aware of geometry and the other artes that contributed to the splendor of painting. And further on, he says he acquired knowledge from Pliny and other authors. So that's a first indication, this knowledge of Pliny and other authors of antiquity, of course, and then also this indication that that Jan van Eyck was specialized in geometry and was aware of the other artes, which are, of course, the artes liberales, the 7 disciplines that formed the basis for late medieval higher education. Now, I was wondering, what would he have known from Pliny? Well, of course, Fazio refers to Pliny the Elder, Naturalis Historia of the 1st century AD, that comprises 37 books, and book 35 on the painters of Greek antiquity was often read by painters in the Renaissance in Italy, but we can see, and it has been noticed by others in the Eyckian literature, by Primisberger, for instance, that indeed there are similarities between the texts of the text of Pliny and the works of Van Eyck. One of the first things that is remarkable is where Pliny starts his book 35 with some sort of aesthetic theoretical statement. He complains about the state of sculpture and the loss of naturalism in the sculpture of his time. And he refers to how much better it was in the past, when sculptors closely followed nature in such a way that very individual traits of the sitters were shown, even with deformations and signs of age. And of course, he refers here to the Roman sculpture of the late Republican era, the 1st century BC, known as Roman Verism. Of course, Jan van Eyck will never have seen such examples, but reading this statement in Pliny reminds us very much of his approach to the naturalistic representation of age, and in some of his portraits. And mainly, of course, I'm thinking of Judocus Veit, but also of Canon van der Pale in Bruges. That, as some of you may know, is so well and realistically painted that today doctors can make a diagnosis of the man's health. He has a typical swelling near the temple, which is apparently a sign of arteritis temporalis, which is a sign of arteritis ophthalmica, which is an infection of the arteries near the eyes and hampers eyesight. Of course, we know and we can see in the painting that Van der Pale wears glasses, but also we know from contemporary documents that he was waived from his duties in choir service in Saint Donation in Bruges, due to his poor health situation. Another example, of course, that immediately comes to mind when we think of this very enormous attention of details and very individual traits of persons, is of course the annotations on the left side of this only drawing known by Van Eyck of Cardinal Albergati in Dresden, where we see these annotations like, and I'm reading only a few of them, tussen den Augen sanguinachtig, boven den Haar waar blijkachtig, die vratte purperachtig, which means between the eyes blood reddish, above near the hair pale, the wrath purplish. And these are color indications, of course, but so detailed and that were used very carefully in, of course, the painting in Vienna that is luckily also preserved. In Pliny, we find a lot of stories about Apelles. Apelles, the greatest painter of all time, court painter of Alexander the Great, and Pliny writes about him in great detail. And he tells, for instance, about one of the competitions he was involved in with colleagues when they were painting horses. Once they were finished, the horses, real horses, were brought to the paintings, and when those horses saw the painting by Apelles, they started to neigh. This is something, a detail that for me immediately reminds the realistic horses in the Ghent altarpiece, and mainly in the Christ, in the Milites Christi. And now after cleaning, and I'm showing you detail after cleaning, where you see the drool coming out of the mouth of the white horse, the vein in his head, and all those small, very realistic details that we see, for instance, the hooves marking in the mud. Another story told by Pliny about Apelles is that the artist made a portrait of Alexander the Great represented as Apollo, and in his hand he held a lightning bolt. And this was so realistically painted that it looked as if that hand really came into the space of the spectator. Well, this relation, building a relation between the suggested space of the painting with the real space of the spectator is something that we find continuously in the works of Van Eyck. It is also called even the Apelles effect. And we see that here with the wing of the angel in the Thyssen-Bornemisza diptych that sticks out in an illusionistic fashion as a trompe-l'œil effect that sticks out of the frame. Also the suckles of those imitation alabaster sculptures seem to come out of the frame that in its own right is illusionistically painted. And of course this very well-known detail already commented on in the 16th century, the foot of Adam sticking out of the frame into the space of the beholder. And the same holds true for the book of one of the prophets that sticks out, and then the bookmark even sticks out a bit more in an illusionistic trompe-l'œil effect. This relation with Apelles and this clear fascination that Jan van Eyck must have had for Apelles as his great predecessor was recognized in the 16th century by the authors at that time. Lucas Deel, for instance, calls Van Eyck den Vlaamschen Apelles, the Flemish Apelles. Marcus van Vaarnewijk in his Den Spiegel der Nederlandse Oudheid of 1568 writes about the Ghent altarpiece, and I quote, "The work is so artful that it would not have to make way for Apelles' work, who is considered as the most artful painter to be found in the world. He was the first learned painter, and he said that it is impossible to be a painter without the knowledge of arithmetics and geometry." Now we can wonder why this fascination for the time of Alexander the Great. Well, there was a cult at the Burgundian court, clearly, where the Duke formed his own political propaganda with a personal iconography based on the big figures from the past, mainly from antiquity, and of those antique heroes, mainly Alexander. That is why the Duke commissions a series of tapestries telling the history of Alexander, which we see here in one of the few pieces that have been preserved in the Galleria Doria Pamphili in Rome, but also in the many illuminated manuscripts that he commissioned treating the life of Alexander the Great, like this manuscript here in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the Livre des Conquêtes et Faits d'Alexandre. Now, like the Duke saw his Alexander the Great as his great predecessor, it is not far-fetched that Jan van Eyck, as a court painter to Duke Philip the Good, saw Apelles as his great predecessor. And this parallelism between contemporary figures in the Burgundian court and at the court of Alexander the Great can perhaps be supported by an old hypothesis by Panofsky, who gave an a possible identification of the sitter in the famous Léal Souvenir, one of the paintings that was in the exhibition. Above that inscription, Léal Souvenir, we can see the Greek letters Timotheos, which is Greek, of course, for honor God. But what is this inscription doing there? Well, to my mind, Panofsky was the only one who came up with a reasonable explanation, saying that it was a reference to Timotheos of Milete, who was the court composer to Alexander the Great, which perfectly fits into this cult I just discussed at the court. And reasoning further along these lines, he suggested that the sitter of this portrait may have been a crypto-portrait or portrait of Gilles Binchois, one of the famous polyphonists at the court of Philip the Good. So perhaps we have here indeed, but of course there are many identifications of the sitter, none, by the way, that convinces. The other element told by Pliny that, excuse me, by Fazio, that Jan van Eyck was a specialist in geometry is a bit puzzling, especially when we look at older studies already from the beginning of the 20th century on perspective in Van Eyck paintings, like this study of Kern. Well, we know that Van Eyck didn't apply linear perspective like it should have been, or according to the rules developed at that very moment by people as Brunelleschi, Masaccio, and then of course codified by Alberti. He uses a vanishing point for the floor, but another one for the ceiling, where of course only one vanishing point should have been used here. So, but he does use vanishing points. What is going on here? Well, the usual explanation is that Van Eyck came up with not with a mathematical or geometrical system for representing spaces, but based on his own accurate observation, he was able to represent the space in a very convincing way. Well, actually, this is a reasoning mistake, or to interpret the words of Fazio in this way is a mistake of reasoning. Fazio clearly refers to the artes liberales. And when we look at what was taught at late medieval universities, but also in Latin schools, and Jan van Eyck must have gone to Latin school, his knowledge of very profound knowledge of Latin is testified by all the inscriptions in his work. Well, what was taught in terms of geometry, the introduction to geometry in the Artes program was the geometry of, or the optics of visual perception. These optics of visual perception were based on, of course, the classical authors, Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, but mainly on Al-Haytham, an Arab scholar who wrote in Cairo in the beginning of the 11th century his text on optics. Well, actually, his treatise deals with three ways of observation. That is optics, that is the direct visual perception. A second way, which he calls cut-up tricks, is the image formation through reflection in mirrors, be it convex, concave, or flat mirrors. And then dioptrics, which is the refraction of light in transparent materials. Well, this text, in this Arab text, was translated into Latin around 1200 under the title De Aspectibus, or Perspectiva, and attributed to Al-Hazan. Al-Hazan is actually a bastardization of Al-Haytham. This text of Al-Hazan became very famous in the course of the 13th century. Especially in the second half of the 13th century, a group of scholastic theologians known as the Perspectivists in Oxford, among whom John Peckham, restructured the text of Al-Hazan into clear propositions and made them thus accessible and usable for teaching in geometry in the Artes curriculum. Another aspect, it was not only structuring or restructuring this very complicated text by Alhazen, but also those theologians gave a Christian theological interpretation to the text, shortly saying that via visual perception, one could get a comprehension of spiritual seeing. And this idea was elaborated later on in the 13th century, and towards the end, scholastic theologian like Pierre de Limoges, who taught at Sorbonne in Paris, wrote in his De Oculo Morali that catoptrics is the reflected vision, the way we see during life in a deformed and vague way. Of course, this is a bit is parallel to the Neoplatonic idea. Then he said, afterlife, however, once we're dead, we will see in an indirect way, according to the laws of dioptrics. And only after the resurrection, we will get a direct vision, eye to eye with God. This is a very important statement, because here we see how this theory derived from physics was used in a metaphysical sense to explain one of the main theological problems already raised by St. Augustine in the 5th century, when he asked, how will we as mortals ever see God? And this solution was thus found by applying the laws of Alhazen onto this metaphysical problem or theological problem. Alhazen's ideas became so widespread, not only in the context of scholarship and theology, but also in literature. We find references to it in Dante, in Chaucer, in preachings even. In art theory, Ghiberti, for instance, in his commentary, refers verbatim to Alhazen. Now we could consider the Italian early Renaissance as reduction of the complexity of late medieval optics. It is a reduction to the direct vision through a window on a geometrized space. Jan van Eyck, at the contrary, introduced into painting this late medieval optics in all its complexity, including its metaphysical dimension. And that is what I call Van Eyck's optical revolution. The purpose, of course, is that through knowledge of visual perception, one gets knowledge of God's creation and of God himself. Now, we can see in his work that he indeed was aware of those optics. And I'm not the first to say some of what I will show is based on the work by my very good colleague, Marc de May. To paint the reflection in a flat mirror is very easy. One doesn't even have to be aware of the optical theory because you can simply see that incident rays of light reflect with the same angle as they come in to the mirror object or surface. It becomes a bit more complex when we are dealing with reflections in a convex mirror. There you need to know that an image, the farther it is removed from the surface of the convex image, the smaller its reflection becomes. Secondly, that this reflected image is always an upright image, and that it is deformed in function of the curvature of the surface of the mirror. It is also a virtual image. It seems to appear behind the mirror because indeed the focal point of a convex mirror is lying behind the circle. And indeed, Van Eyck applies all those rules in his famous mirror in the Arnolfini double portrait in London. Indeed, every orthogonal perpendicular to the picture plane is deformed in function of the curvature of the mirror, the convex mirror. We see a window that we don't see in the painting itself, and moreover we see again the space outside the picture, the space of the viewer reflected in the space of the painting. So here again we see this connection being made between the space of the beholder with this illusionistic painted space. We see that St. George holds a red flagpole, which is reflected in the breastplate of his harness in a deformed way, in a broken way according to the curvature of this convex mirroring surface. On the other hand, we see a reflection of the world outside the painting, again our world, the world of the viewer, in the shoulder piece of St. George. On the other hand, he holds a concave tournament shield in which we see the reflections of the windows of the Veit Chapel, the original place of the Ghent altarpiece. These reflections are inversed and painted according to the rules of reflections in concave mirrors. One of those rules says that if the object is further removed from the mirror than its focal point, then we get an inverted image, which is exactly the case here. He is also well aware of refraction of light. And we can see that here in the crystal scepter held on the one hand by the God figure in the Ghent altarpiece, which we see here at the right, and also by in the scepter held by the Angel of the Annunciation in the Washington Annunciation. In the Ghent altarpiece, the light comes consequently from the upper right-hand side. It hits every object and leaves casting shadows, like well known of the frames in the exterior panels in the interiors. Here also the light comes evidently from the upper right, but as this material is very clear, most of the light passes and we see only a very delicate highlight on the right hand side of the scepter. Most light penetrates in this crystal material, refracts actually, And after an internal reflection, refracts a second time on the outside. As much light has come in, much light comes also out a second time, and in this secondary reflection, I'm sorry, and leaves a focal point on the hand of the God figure and of the angel, respectively. So this is perfectly according to the laws described by Al-Hasan of refractions of light in transparent materials such as crystal, glass, water, and so forth. Another example that is derived from the studies of Professor de May is the pearls and beads, crystal beads in the inscription of the Godfather on the breast of the Godfather, chest of the Godfather. We see an alternation of crystal beads and of pearls dangling from this garment. And in the crystal beads, we see a specular reflection. Much light travels through the bead, refracts a second time, and leaves a clear highlight on the backside because much light comes out. And even in some cases, like in the middle one, forms a focal point behind the bead. On the other hand, in the pearls, we see a more diffuse material, so a much more diffused reflection. Less light travels through this denser material, and less light comes out and leaves a faint trace on the backside of the pearl. And here we see, of course, no formation of a focal point, but usually the formation of a shadow casted onto the red velvet. These examples here of refraction of light are very well known, and they appear in several instances in Van Eyck's work. Here, it has already been shown by Miller-Tmies in the 1950s that this is an allusion to a Mariological hymn saying that Mary is as pure as light traveling through water without contaminating it. So again, we have this metaphysical component of the physical reality. Actually, it is in the words of Van Eyck and in the oeuvre of Van Eyck self that we find the clue to this fascination with optics and with vision itself. One of the few words that we can read in the book on the right-hand side of the Virgin Annunciate is in the middle here, indicated in purple letters, De Visione Dei, about the vision of God. So indeed, Jan van Eyck is fascinated with visual perception because for him, it's a pathway to knowing God's creation better. I've written more about all this in the catalog of the exhibition, Van Eyck, an Optical Revolution, which is published in 4 editions, and then also in another book that I've edited with a colleague, Danny Praat, and bundles a number of articles mainly from Ghent colleagues. Here, the book on the Ghent altarpiece, which has been published last year. I thank you very much for your attention.
All right, Max, thank you very much for this clarification, for this clarifying talk about the underlying ideas that were central to the making of that exceptional exhibition on Van Eyck. Your talk, but also, of course, the exhibition itself made perfectly clear that Van Eyck can really be understood, can only be understood as a Pictor Doctus. Everyone is more than welcome to put his or her questions on the chat. I already see them coming. I will moderate those questions, but first I have a question myself. Max, since you are also the coordinator of the research that supports the restoration of the Ghent altarpiece, I think you are the most ideal person to ask in how far that restoration sheds new light on Van Eyck, and in how far those new insights from the restoration could be presented in the exhibition.
Well, basically, we came to the conclusion that where the Ghent altarpiece, and I mentioned that briefly in the talk, has always been considered as a difficult piece in the oeuvre. Of course, you have the whole problem of the division of hands between Hubert and Jan, who did what, and so forth. And we didn't realize at all that the painting was so much overpainted mainly in the 16th century, but also later on. So it's not only a matter of finding Hubert's hand and Jan's, but it was a matter of distinguishing many hands, of course, to start with, of course, probably also workshop collaborators of Hubert and Jan, but also these later editions made by other painters, of course, like Van Scoorl and Blondet. By removing those overpaintings, we saw that mainly in the outside wings, that now can be, without a doubt, be fully attributed to Jan. That it adheres perfectly to what we know of his other works. On the level of the underdrawing, the paint layers, and the finishing. I mean, this is completely like, to give a simple example. There were added highlights in the hands and the face of Eudokus Fate, which in retrospect, you would consider as 16th century editions, but no one has ever seen that before. And it was only with the restoration, by carefully looking at the layered structure of the painting and also using new technologies like macro XRF and high-resolution 3D microscopy, that we were able to distinguish these later editions from the original paint layers. So that is basically the main finding of the restoration. What does it all mean? That is another question. Of course, you have repairs of damage. But why some areas that were barely damaged were overpainted with other colors remains a complete mystery. Well, mystery, you can think that it is an adaptation to the taste of the time. On the other hand, and I saw one of the questions in the chat on which I will already anticipate, there are areas that were absolutely not damaged at all, like indeed the lamb. And Of course, it was already known that it was overpainted since the previous restoration. It had 4 ears because in the 50s they removed some of the contours, and since then it had 4 ears, the 2 original ones, the 2 overpainted ones. But in Koolman's time, that is the 1950s, it was generally thought that it was a 19th century intervention. Now, we absolutely know for sure that it is a mid-16th century intervention, most probably by Blondel and Van Scoor. This has obviously theological implications, and we are still working on that. The research is going on, and we still have to figure out what exactly happened there. But it seems to me very obvious that this is a change of meaning that has theological implications. Well, in how far could we show all that in the show? We were only able to show the outside wings. I think by comparing and contrasting with other works by Van Eyck, we could at least show how much of a unity this the outside wings show with the other known works, of which we were able to assemble a dozen of the 20 odd paintings that still survive. And yes, I think that was the main purpose of the exhibition, actually showing this this coherence and style of Van Eyck's work. Jan van Eyck.
Thank you. Another question by Marianne Pantjes. What choices did you make in preparing the exhibition to make the complex principle of optics accessible to a broad audience?
Well, that was extremely difficult. In the audio guide, we explained some of the details that I've shown. For instance, where you have the Washington Annunciation was there in the show, and then there it was explained what he did with optics. Also in the text, along with the Virgin Annunciate, this business with the Divisione Dei and so forth. So there we were able, but of course, presenting all this complicated optical theory is very difficult for a larger public, but I think in that sense the catalog, which is not a real catalog but a bundle of essays, is complementary to what we could show as a visual experience. Our idea was also, well, we called it the optical revolution, and I explained why. But what we wanted is for the spectator, for the visitors, to have an optical revelation, actually. And according to the press and everyone I heard who visited the show, that succeeded apparently.
I think so, yes, you certainly did. The question of Michael Partington is anticipating on one of those, is bringing back one of those reviews by Jonathan Jones in The Guardian, who writes that the real meaning of the Ghent altarpiece for its creator is not religious, it's about art. And then the question that turns up is, given the link between optics and God's creation, how do you respond to the statement of Jonathan Jones in The Guardian?
Well, to consider 15th century art as religious art, as not religious, is nonsense. But of course you have this extra layer, but I would not say that the Ghent the œuvre of Jan van Eyck is l'art pour l'art. That is a modern concept. But it does have these different layers, and I think as he refers to Pliny, as I believe and I try to show, that he works for learned public also, and that his works were meant to be starting points for discussion and recognition of texts of antique authors, and especially Pliny. So there's a differentiation, of course, in reading, but it certainly has. And I would like to recall an article written by my fellow editor, Donny Praat, of this book on the Ghent altarpiece, this other book that we've produced, where he showed that the seven virtues is one of the central issues in the opened state of the Ghent altarpiece, and this whole theory that plays with ideas of Thomas of Aquino and so forth makes a lot of sense, I think, and provides a very coherent reading on a theological level. But there are still many problems, and not only art historians but also theologians are discussing many aspects still, and it isn't fortunately for us art historians, we're not ready with interpretation yet.
Fortunately, indeed. Another question is the first painting we saw at the exhibition is the Adam by Van Eyck. Was that a deliberate choice in that way, a suggestion to let the first man be also the first painting?
Yes. It started with the representation of man. Yes, absolutely. Also, it's one of, since the 16th century, when the altarpiece was called the Tafel van Adam and Eva, and not any longer use Feitstafel, which it was called in the 15th century. That is such a famous panel that we needed to start with that. Even if it has not been cleaned, and those panels belong to the third phase, which hopefully will start in 21. But we don't know yet to the current situation, of course. But anyhow, yes, it was deliberate to start with that as a shock effect. And I have a little incident. I had to be a guide for a sheikh, and I didn't really know what to do when we came in front of the naked Adam and Eve. But fortunately for me, he was rather Western in his ideas. So that was,
Actually, an extra question to this one. It also takes few rooms before we really see a painting of Van Eyck. We see it in representation, we see it on pictures, large pictures. But the very first one is like the fourth room when we see it, or the third. Is that also a deliberate choice? Because you first present the influence on Van Eyck, Van Eyck, and then Van Eyck themselves.
But it was on purpose. It has to do with the space of the museum in Ghent that we could use. So we used, let's say, half of the museum. We expected many more visitors than ever before in this exhibition in the Museum of Ghent. And one of the things we wanted to avoid was that huge piles of people would, or huge masses of people would pile up in front of these small paintings. So that it was a very deliberate choice to disperse the people by having a very, very long introduction. We thought a lot about that. A second reason was that the museum has now, the main galleries are conditioned in top-notch level, but not all of them. The back rooms where the exhibition started with the introduction are open rooms, and it's very difficult to condition them to the most severe standards that we needed. And so we invested more than 1 million euros in front of conditioning, for conditioning those main exhibition rooms, which are of course rather small, and also having had the experience in previous big blockbuster shows with many people, 7 rows in front of one painting, and we wanted to avoid that at all costs. Of course, we used time slots and so forth, and it didn't always work, but I mean, it usually worked. People could see the show, and that was our main purpose, to have a very good experience for each visitor, and not being in too crowded rooms. So it was an idea of having a good flow of the masses.
Yeah, I visited the exhibition twice, and indeed, you could see even the very small paintings. It was not that crowded that you had to push people aside. So that worked really well. Another question, a very brief question, I guess. Where is the art that it was on loan? Where are they currently?
The works have all returned except for the Madonna at the Fountain, that is still, which belongs of course to the Museum of Antwerp, but that is still closed, and it will be another few years, as far as I know. And the Madonna in the Fountain, at the Fountain, is still in Ghent. All the others have been returned as soon as it was possible to after the lockdown. So most of the works have been returned in the course of the month of May.
Mm-hmm. And then a very practical question: how did you get a loan from the Washington Annunciation, and how do you bring those very important works back in times of COVID?
Yeah, the last one that was really a problem. Couriers couldn't travel. We had instances where we had to send paintings back without couriers. That was a really horrific situation. But how we got the loans, well, like every big show and everyone who has experience with that, you start with the easy pieces, and those paintings that have traveled before. The Washington Annunciation was in Bruges in 2002. It was in the show in Boijmans in, when was it? I forgot, the way to Van Eyck. So it had traveled before. Also, it's a matter of having a network of colleagues in the museums, of course, and I've known John Hand, who was still the curator at that time. When we negotiated, I've known John for more than 30 years, so that makes talking about these issues a bit easier than if you don't know the people. So that, frankly, that was also the reason why Til Borchert was involved in the show, because museum network is even bigger than mine. And of course, still did a lot of other work also in terms of content and so forth. But in terms of negotiating, building bridges with landers and so forth, that was really important. And then, of course, once you get a few major pieces, the other ones start to come along and become more lenient, like the National Gallery. The Léon Souvenir had never left the museum before. And of course, we were not always successful. I can say that now. I went to see the curator of 15th and 16th century painting in the Louvre, and she said, "Mais évidemment, Max, on va prêter, pas de problème." But then with the Louvre, all the problems started. And they needed to restore the Roland Madonna exactly at the moment of the exhibition. I don't know if they did it. I don't think so. But after 200 years, all of a sudden it needed to be restored. So that was one that we couldn't get. Some other pieces may not leave the museum. The Luca Madonna in Frankfurt, by the statutes of the museum, it cannot leave it. So that was impossible to get. But everything that was possible, most of the things we thought we could get, we did get. I never asked for the Arnolfini portrait, for instance, nor the man with the red turban at the National Gallery, not only being afraid of being kicked out of the door when I would ask for that, but I know these paintings are so central to the institution that, well, it's not done to ask for pieces like that. So it's also a matter of being reasonable, I guess, and of course, not taking unnecessary risks.
All right. Maybe a last question, because it also is a bit a question to keep for the last, I guess. Are you ever finished with Van Eyck? And actually, the very question is, what's your next research topic on Van Eyck, or research question?
Well, we will start phase 3 of the restoration, which is the upper register of the inner side. As I said, as soon as possible, but for this moment we cannot work due to the current COVID conditions. So that is, of course, one thing that will keep me busy for another 4 years, I guess. What I also refer to, that is this research on the reason, well, the meaning of these overpaints. That is something that is in the pipeline, for which I filled out applications to get the money and the personnel to do it. And then I've been working since 15 years now on an exhibition of Quentin Matsys, which I consider as the biggest Flemish painter between Van Eyck and Bruegel, and I hope that will come true before I die of COVID or I have to retire.
Oh, that's a very good sentence to end. So we all hope you won't die of COVID. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
With the wonderful presentation, but also those new lights, those insights on how to organize an exhibition, how to follow a clear line, how to tell actually new stuff about a very, very famous painter in a most fascinating exhibition. Thank you very much, Max. And all of you, thank you for being here. And next talk will be with the Crest Fellows within 2 weeks. You will find information on our website, Online Museum Talks Leiden. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye.